Hello and welcome to another video. So once again, I'm going to be taking a look at a game that I've worked on and look at some of the technical aspects, some of the design aspects, and share information about that, and also make some of the code for these things available. So today going to be taking a look at a game called Monument. So this was, I think, actually the first one where I was experimenting with having sort of, ways of very light sort of interaction between other people playing the particular game. So the idea was it was supposed to just be a very small, very chill game where what you would do is you interact with this environment and you can essentially, leave messages and plant trees. So if we take a look on the main menu, it shows us how many trees have been planted and how many messages have been left. And then when we're in the game, it's pretty straightforward. There's a whole bunch of trees that have already been placed, but there are a bunch of ones that haven't. And if I go and place one, then it becomes sort of solid. So we've got a nice clear indication. And that information actually goes up to the server, and those trees, it doesn't do a direct one-for-one mapping of, oh, okay, this tree's been planted, so it will be planted for everyone. Instead, what it does is it uses that as sort of a proportion for how many of these are filled in. Idea being, didn't want sort of the players to have to be doing essentially a hunt for a tree that they could go and plant. Wanted ones to be able to be readily available. So it's a bit of a random distribution there of what it will actually do. And the environment is very simplistic. This was done in quite an early version of Unity and was also a bit of a challenge with the amount of trees and things like that I had in this. There are a lot of trees. Trying to get that actually performant. That's why there's no shadows cast on the ground. It's also a procedurally generated sort of environment. I'm going to just cheat and jump off the side here. There's no fall damage or anything like of that. So it's intended that there's areas where you can just sort of look out. So this terrain was sculpted, and then the procedural sort of side was the scattering of the trees and also the sculpting of the terrain itself. So those were both aspects that I kind of automated. So I built this as a Unity terrain and then adapted it from that because I wanted this low poly sort of look to it. And you'll notice the water is slowly moving. That is one of the bits of code I will share. At this point, I wasn't particularly versed in shaders, so it's actually all being done by directly modifying the mesh, which is not super ideal. These days I would definitely do that in a shader. And I'd be able to have the shadows going on these so they'd feel a bit more grounded. But the central sort of feature area is this monument where there's these messages that people have left and they are just slowly cycling up. Can support a lot of bricks, keeps track of how many things have been planted. We can see all of that here. And some nice UI that's clearly sort of reacting to when we're near it. It does also fade it as we're further away. So when we're closer, it gets brighter. And then we have, once the cursor is able to be clicked in, then it's able to, it highlights clearly what we're focused on. So one of the things with this is this was a system where you could support, or the game supported, anyone accessing this, and the game was free and still is free, so anyone could leave a message. Now the idea, and I intentionally canvassed a bunch of folks to get some initial messages so that it started with ones that were positive, But the key thing there was I wanted it to remain positive messages. And the challenge with that is you give people a means to anonymously post text that other people are going to see. You guarantee that you are going to get people who are going to post things that are, either just, not in sort of keeping with the chill, supportive, positive spirit of this, but also intentionally get ones where people are just going to post absolutely awful things and see what the most awful thing they can post is, and know that then that's going to be visible to everyone else. At least that's what people might think with going into this. So the way that I set this up is there are actually two sets of data. Whenever you submit a message, that does get stored in your local set of player messages. When you submit a message, and assuming it has an internet connection, that also sends it up to a server. Now, those messages on the server are initially not going to be ever visible to anyone. What happens is they go up to the server, they are flagged as, not yet reviewed, and then I created a secondary app, which looks like this, and I just had this as a thing on my actual phone. And what this app would do, and this went through a completely separate endpoint. So it wasn't an interface that if you used the actual sort of game, you couldn't disassemble the game and be able to deduce what the interface was for this, for approving messages, very intentionally. Because when you've got stuff that has user-generated content, you kind of got to assume that whatever the worst possible thing that someone could do is, they're going to find a way to do it. So the messages would go up. They would be in the unapproved state. No game ever actually pulls down any messages that are not in the approved state. So ones that are unapproved never actually even make it onto the user's computer. The server, when they're requesting messages, enforces that. Again, the only interface the game has access to is able to, that interface can only give you back approved messages. So this allowed me to control and manage so that what would happen is I'd go and if the message was appropriate, I would approve it. And then that could appear back into the game, and that could appear then for everyone. If the message was a inappropriate message, then what I would do is I would either generally just reject that message. In some cases, if there was a flood of horrible messages being sent through, and which did happen at times, they'd all be sitting there in the unapproved state. They would be all from a similar time. So it was a case of I would just do a bulk, rejection of those ones. So it was actually something where even if people did go and spam it, it was able to be fairly easily blocked and dealt with. So that was sort of a important thing from the design of this, was making sure that there were controls in there for that, of being able to filter those messages. So man, if someone wanted to be just a horrible, toxic person, they could, but only they would see their toxicity. So that was just, I felt a fairly effective way of actually doing it. So, that's something to always consider when you are doing user-generated content and they are able to submit things. You want to make sure that there are ways to filter that, because even if it's user-generated content, if you are pulling that into, another person's game, you have a responsibility there to make sure that that content is appropriate. That is something that you do need to ensure that you're actually, taking responsibility seriously there. And depending upon where you're located, there's also going to likely be legal requirements there. So it's good to be thinking about that from the beginning. So the thing I would always encourage there is, as soon as you have user-generated content, ask yourself, what is the worst possible thing that someone could do with this? And assume that people are going to try and do that. And then design your systems defensively to actually adjust for that and allow for that, and to ensure that people aren't going to be able to, abuse those systems. So let's look at some of the pieces of how this is actually working. So kind of the major sort of sections with this, if we take a look at something very simple to begin with, like the water mesh, this was pretty straightforward. Had controls for how high things could actually move, and I likely should be able to adjust that while it's actually playing, once it decides to start playing. So with that, if I go to the game view, sorry, the scene view, we can see that it is moving there. And if I adjust things like the height, that's going to adjust it. So the idea was I just wanted low, gentle sort of waves moving throughout it. So this is just a heavily tessellated mesh. And what it's doing logic-wise is pretty straightforward. So the actual mesh, it does do some updating there in terms of the scale of everything. And then that's just sort of populating the vertex data for it. So nothing really particularly complex. And then it's just continually applying Perl and noise to it based upon the current time. So nothing particularly complicated. Definitely not ideal from a performance point of view. As I said, these days, get rid of that one. These days I would entirely do this in shaders. I wouldn't do this via just directly manipulating the vertices. That's not the ideal way of doing it. Then we have our terrain set up here. And this is something where you can actually see the original, if I toggle which ones are shown. What I did was I actually built this originally, and the rough painting was just for me marking out areas where I would want to be able to support having trees. So we can see this terrain gives us something that's a very smooth appearance, which was not sort of in keeping with the visual style I was going for with it. So that one ended up becoming our actual mesh here that highlights the edges and everything. And I had this tree generation script, which what it would do is, if we take a look at this, logic here behind the tree generation, and this was something that I would essentially just run it briefly to get things configured and then save that data out. So it was going through and it was clearing out any of our existing trees, and it had this texture map that we saw here for controlling, there we go, for controlling what areas trees could be placed. So that came from the actual sort of overview. That's why there was the coloring there was for it. And all I was doing was just generating noise and doing a check for if it was above the threshold. And that was then running our logic for placing a tree. So pretty straightforward in terms of what it was actually doing. It would build up candidates for those locations. So the process was the Perl and noise was sort of a hard cutoff for, as was the actual sort of map information, was a hard cutoff for whether things could go in there. We got slope information out, and then when it was actually going and doing the placing, what it would then do is it was just random rolling and just picking, trees that were below that particular sort of weight. And that worked quite well. It was doing some raycasting for placing them so it could, orient them properly. It would do a little bit of random scaling of those trees. So everyone sees the same set of trees, but what actually happens is that initial set of ones, there was a little bit of just random generation in terms of the scaling, the positioning of stuff, the orientation. All of those areas were just sort of randomized a little bit. So that was really sort of handy having that. That did actually make it a lot easier for working with. Because I wasn't using the Unity terrain, so I couldn't use the trees via the terrain system. So that was sort of a big limitation there with that. But that worked quite nicely for, I was happy with how the distribution of those looked. The only downside, like I said, was the ability to support being able to have, shadows and things like of that. It was the main sort of limitation that ran into there with it, that, it didn't have shadows on any of these trees. It is something where I'd be kind of interested to see how it would go turning stuff like that back on. So I think the trees could cast shadows on themselves, but the actual terrain mesh itself didn't support shadows. So that's why it ends up looking kind of the way that it does. So they don't end up looking super grounded, which is not particularly great. So that's how we generated all of the sort of trees in this. And the monument itself is kind of the biggest sort of central feature part. So the idea behind that is it needed to support kind of an arbitrary number of bricks being present there. So I needed to be able to essentially have it math the actual movement of those. And so if we take a look at what actually happens with how a lot of this stuff works, it has some basic calculations that it's doing for, the number of bricks, things like that. There's some basic stuff for talking to the server. I do have an interface where I can actually manually add bricks, but only when I'm in the editor. So that was my way of sort of testing, being able to support a lot of different ones. Was getting there and giving it a bit of a debug key. And so we can see as I'm adding in more, there's times where it does a bit of a jump. And we'll be able to see it more clearly once I'm right up close to it. So supporting being able to just manually trigger a spawning of particular ones. So there we go, it's adding in more ones, queuing up. So as more and more queue up, it's going to be able to rescale this. It does have restrictions on sort of how rapidly they spawn to avoid it going too ridiculous. And it does have this sort of breathe in and breathe out effect. So I wanted it to be a nice sort of smooth movement there with it. It was going to, it was periodically checking to see if there were new server messages. So that was a regular thing. So if you were running it and a new message got submitted and that was actually updated, then that would actually go and spawn that in there. So this is part of the code I will actually share. So if we did some bit of logic there to essentially preheat it. The idea behind that, and so we could control the amount that it should be preheating. The reason for that was to have as smooth a transition as possible. So that just ensured a whole bunch of ones were already prepared, already positioned, so that from the very beginning, a set of ones would already be there. So by the time you moved over to it, you would be able to actually see those. So we're using property blocks, fairly standard for configuring the appearance of the particular blocks. And all we did was just adjust the azimuth. And then so the progressive updating was just doing some calculations. So, based upon the time, we was just updating the azimuth and the elevation and adjusting things like the transparency. So the idea is the bricks kind of move out in a bit of a sphere, but when they actually sort of more the top, then we can start to actually, fade them out, things like of that. So it gave us a way to be able to have that appearance work quite nicely and have it be a smooth transition with everything. So that worked quite well. So yeah, once it reached the max azimuth, we'd get rid of it. So it would go back to the pending bricks and it would be removed from the active list. We had our cooldown for being able to add new particular ones, and that was tied to the sort of speed that we were rotating things at. Again, we're trying to, with this, I was trying to maintain a slow, steady, even pacing with it. The pulse was pretty straightforward. I've used this in a few different ones. So using sine curve and just feeding time into it. So that just allowed it to, everything could be rotating, but because the radius was changing on a sine curve, things would naturally do that moving out and in as they were rotating around. So that allowed, when we were doing the calculations for where to position things, all I would need to do was I just directly position them. I didn't even need to do any lerping because they were moving quite slowly. And I was updating them every frame. And it would also adjust the rotation of it so that the brick was actually always pointing out. And that was something where I didn't really sort of directly math that based upon where the center was. I just rotated them at essentially counter to the actual matching speed of how the actual the monument as a whole was rotating. So the monument is rotating as a whole, and then the bricks are counter rotating in sync with that to keep them so the messages were always facing outwards. And that worked quite well. With the sort of setup with the messages, as I already said, it adds in your local messages first. So anything that you have actually submitted gets populated in there first, and then it pulls messages from the server. So the game did ship with a bunch of built-in ones in case people were playing and weren't online. And so those were seeded ones that I'd sourced from folks initially. But it always puts in set of both, and it can then pull down the messages from the server. It ensures that they are unique. So what it does for that comparison is if we take a look at the message itself, it just takes a look and checks, okay, do they have the same color, content, and author? If they do, then they're considered the same. So fairly straightforward for being able to actually manage that. But it would mean that we'd get sort of that full set. So you would get local messages that you'd said would be prioritized. So if you had ones that you'd submitted and then moved over to the monument, you were more likely to see them sooner. And then the server messages would typically be after that. The process for queuing messages, all of that logic was all pretty straightforward. It's just spawning from prefabs, setting the appropriate material, and being able to actually just link up the particular text for it. So nothing particularly tricky with any of the aspects for that. And I messed around with sort of a few other approaches for positioning the bricks. I did, and this code you can see is disabled, didn't end up being used. I did experiment with having something where it was sort of making more of a structure, so more of a tower, and that didn't really work well. So I opted to get rid of that. So that was something where I was just making a four-sided tower. And that worked okay, but the visual wasn't good. And it also meant that needed a huge number of messages, like an absolutely huge number of messages, to have it be anything more than a trivial height. And odds were, this wasn't going to get a lot of messages. So that's why I opted for the approach of having them be in that sphere that's moving around and pulsing. It ended up being a vibe that I felt worked better with that slow movement and pulsing, like having that motion in it was good. It fit sort of the more chill vibes to it. And it also meant that with a smaller amount of messages, it was actually taking up more sort of visual space there in the screen, which I think worked well for it. But I've kept the code there for that positioning of the bricks. So if you're wanting to do something where you are positioning a whole bunch of bricks, that logic is still there, and you could make use of that in your own project. So I will include that in the particular code that I make available for this, just so that you've got that there. I won't be including things like the server interface. There's not a lot to the server interface itself, and it's also one that this was the first time of me building a server interface like that, and that very much shows in it. So as well as, it is using things that are now deprecated in newer versions of Unity, but it's also using approaches that I wouldn't actually recommend using anymore. So I cleaned up the way that it gets handled a lot. The one thing that I would say with sort of the server side that I did have to wrangle with a bit was I wanted this to be able to support being able to use pretty much any character or symbol that you could submit. So supporting things like most of your emojis, those extended characters. That was something where getting that data correctly up to the server and back down was fun. And what I found was the most effective way to do that was I actually ended up encoding the messages. So if we take a look at what I was doing with the particular messages, I actually am doing this process of using system convert and getting the bytes for the message and converting it to a base 64 string. That actually ended up being the easiest way for me to be sending this up to the server and getting it back down reliably. So we'd encode it to base 64, send that to the server, and then get it back from the server with that same encoding and convert it back. So that ended up being sort of the easiest way. The other thing that I fortunately did was I included versioning support. That is probably the other big thing that is worth mentioning from the server side. If you were doing anything, essentially anything I would say communications related, if you are, saving data, so that's sort of a communications related thing. If you are sending stuff to a server, communicating between things like of that, or working with data where you're storing it out and loading it back, from the very, 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 very beginning, I recommend making sure that you put in a version. With all of the server communications, the way I always structure them is the very first thing that gets sent to the server. So in the data that gets sent to the server, and the very first thing that comes in the data from the server is always a version. The reason being is that as soon as if you've got your version in there and the version is working reliably, then if you need to update things, you can always do changes to support that. Because in my case, the issue with the emoji support, that actually, the version that got released was version 1 of all of the strings and everything, or version 1 of all of the communications, and that didn't properly support it. So I ended up with, I would have versions of the game that might only support version 1 strings, and people might not have updated to supporting version 2. And I would have, ones where people are still submitting things in version 1, and so I needed to wrangle different versions there between client and server. But because I had put that version support in from early on, that made that process relatively painless. So I was able to do conversions. So that's why, like of this, it checks the version, and if it's a version greater than 2, then it's able to do this conversion logic, or greater than or equal to 2. Otherwise, it just passes it straight through. So supporting versioning from the very beginning is something that I strongly recommend anytime you are communicating information, whether that's sending it to a server, whether that is working with save games, saving out any form of data like of that. Always put in a version number from the very beginning, and always make sure the version number is pretty much at the very beginning of the data. You might want to have a little bit of a sort of header or preamble indication to specify the type of file or data that's being sent, but that should be something that's never going to be changing for you, and then the version number needs to be next. So really, really, really important to do those things. It's going to make your life much easier. I say that as someone who's learnt this the hard way of previously having done apps where I had not done versioning and making that work. When you've got customers with data there, that was a lesson that I learnt, and I made sure I learned it and kept with it for all of the ones in future. I managed to avoid data loss for any customers with that, but it was I was extra careful with the testing for that. So version numbers from the beginning. And as I was saying, when you're dealing with something that has user-generated data, that user-generated data is visible to other users, have checks and balances in there. Assume that someone is going to try and do the worst, most heinous possible things with that, and design your systems accordingly. Make it so that there are different interfaces, make it so that from the game itself, there's no way to get data that hasn't actually gone through some checks and balances. Make it so that those interfaces for actually reviewing and approving things, that can't be deduced from the actual game or client that you're distributing it yourself. That's just really important to make sure that you're designing with that sort of worst case scenario in mind. As I said with this, even for a small free game where the particular vibe of it was basically saying nice supportive things, I still did get a bunch of ones that people were submitting there that were things that I was not going to let be distributed to everyone playing the game because they were awful. And so that's just something to make sure you're designing for that, because you're going to then ensure that your product, your sort of game that you're putting together isn't being used for purposes that you didn't plan for. So just something to always keep in mind with user-generated data. But as I said, I'm going to make a bunch of this code available, and that code, it will have some dependencies missing. That's a necessary thing because some of the dependencies are things that I am not able to distribute, like WIs, the licenses for that. I'm not going to be able to include code for things like that. So I'll just include code for a few key areas there. But you'll have those available if you're wanting to dive into those and look at using any of that in your own projects. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting. If you have found it interesting, chuck on a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code that I mentioned I'd be making available, there is a link to that in the description below. Said you can use that in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you have any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description also. But until next time, bye.